If Elena Carter had arrived 30 seconds later, Adrian Whitmore would have taken his last sip of whiskey without ever knowing the man beside him wanted him gone. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackthorn Grand Hotel, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred streaks of silver and gold. Inside the private executive lounge on the 42nd floor, everything smelled expensive. Aged oak, leather chairs, crystal glasses. The quiet confidence of people who had never worried about overdraft fees or late rent notices. Elena moved carefully between tables, balancing a polished tray against one hand while the low sound of jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. She wore the same black uniform as every other waitress in the building, but unlike the others, she watched people instead of conversations. Hands, eyes, reflections in glass. The way nervous fingers tapped against a table. The way lies sounded different after midnight. Table 12 needs another round, the manager whispered while rushing past her. The Whitmore account. Biggest deal this place has seen all year. Don't screw it up. Elena nodded once. Quiet. Professional. Invisible. That was how she survived New York. Table 12 sat near the windows beneath a chandelier that looked like falling ice. Adrian Whitmore barely glanced up as she approached. He looked exactly like the magazines described him. Tall. Controlled. Dark navy suit tailored within an inch of perfection. Steel gray eyes focused on financial projections glowing across a tablet screen. Beside him sat Nathaniel Graves, his longtime business partner and closest advisor. Unlike Adrian, Nathaniel smiled too easily. The kind of smile people practiced in mirrors. Another McAllen, Nathaniel said smoothly before Elena could speak. Neat. For both of us. Elena reached for the crystal glasses, but something stopped her. A reflection. Tiny. Barely visible in the polished metal ice bucket beside the table. Nathaniel's hand slipping briefly inside his jacket pocket. Adrian continued speaking to investors without noticing. Once the merger closes Friday, we'll expand into Chicago and Seattle before Q4. Calm. Confident. Powerful. Completely unaware. Elena's stomach tightened. She had seen that movement before years ago during behavioral threat assessment training. Small concealments. Fast hand motions. Controlled breathing afterward. Most people missed them because rich men in expensive suits rarely looked dangerous. Nathaniel lifted his own glass first, but he didn't drink. He only watched Adrian. Waiting. Elena suddenly heard Nathaniel's voice from 20 minutes earlier replaying inside her mind near the service hallway. Tonight ends everything. At the time, she told herself it could mean business. Contracts. Corporate politics. But now his eyes looked wrong. Too focused. Too calm. The investors laughed at something Adrian said. No one noticed Elena stepping closer to the table. No one noticed her pulse beginning to race beneath the sleeves of her uniform. Adrian finally reached for the whiskey glass. The city lights reflected softly across the amber liquid. One sip. That was all it would take. Elena moved before she could second-guess herself. Her hand struck the glass hard enough to send it flying across the marble table. Whiskey exploded over Adrian's suit jacket and shattered across the floor. The entire room froze. Conversations died instantly. A woman near the piano gasped softly. Nathaniel stood up so fast his chair scraped violently against the floor. What the hell is wrong with you? He snapped. Adrian rose slowly, stunned disbelief written across his face as expensive liquor dripped from his sleeve. Security guards near the elevator immediately started toward the table. Elena's breathing stayed steady, even though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Nathaniel looked furious. Not embarrassed. Furious. And somehow that frightened her more. I'm so sorry, sir, she said quietly, though her eyes never left Nathaniel. But if you drank that whiskey, she swallowed once, you wouldn't have made it out of this room. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Rain continued sliding down the dark glass windows behind them, while the shattered whiskey spread slowly across the marble floor like liquid amber. Adrian Whitmore looked down at his ruined jacket, then back at Elena. His expression was unreadable now. Calm on the surface, dangerous underneath. The kind of silence powerful men used before deciding someone's future. Nathaniel recovered first. Get security up here now, he snapped sharply toward the guards approaching from the elevators. This woman is unstable. Elena stood perfectly still. She could feel every pair of eyes in the executive lounge locked onto her black waitress uniform. The investors at the table exchanged nervous glances. One older man quietly pushed his untouched drink farther away. Adrian slowly removed the soaked suit jacket and draped it over the back of his chair. "Explain," he said coldly. His voice was controlled, but Elena noticed the slight tension in his jaw. He was angry, embarrassed, and trying not to show either. Elena swallowed carefully. The drink was tampered with. Nathaniel laughed immediately, too quickly. "This is insane." He turned toward Adrian with practiced disbelief. "She spills a $700 whiskey all over you, and suddenly she is making accusations." Elena kept her eyes on Nathaniel instead of Adrian. "You never drank from your own glass." That landed. Small, subtle, but enough. Nathaniel's confident posture shifted for half a second before recovering. "What?" Elena spoke quietly. "You ordered 2 identical drinks, but you only watched his." The room felt colder suddenly. Adrian looked between them slowly. Elena could almost see the calculations happening behind his gray eyes. Nathaniel forced a smile. "Adrian, this is ridiculous. She is inventing a story because she panicked after embarrassing herself." Security finally arrived beside the table. 2 men in dark suits waited for instructions. The hotel manager appeared moments later, sweating despite the cold air conditioning. "Mr. Whitmore," he began nervously, "I sincerely apologize for this incident. The employee will be terminated immediately." "No," Adrian's voice cut cleanly through the room. Everyone froze again. Even Elena looked surprised. Adrian stepped closer to the table and stared down at the broken crystal scattered across the floor. "Nobody touches anything." Nathaniel frowned. "Adrian, you said this merger required caution," Adrian interrupted quietly. "I am being cautious." The investors fell silent. Elena noticed one of the guards discreetly moving the untouched second glass away from the table using a napkin. Nathaniel's smile disappeared completely now. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan like distant drums. Adrian finally looked directly at Elena for the first time since she knocked the glass away. Really looked at her. Not as staff, not as background noise, as a variable he had not predicted. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena Carter." "And how exactly did you decide my drink was poisoned, Elena?" Her fingers trembled slightly at her sides, but her voice stayed calm. "Because I saw him put something into it." The words dropped heavily into the silence. Nathaniel stepped forward immediately. "That is a lie." Elena met his eyes without flinching. "Then let them test the whiskey." Nathaniel opened his mouth again, but Adrian lifted one hand slightly. Quiet, simple, controlled, yet somehow more powerful than shouting. Adrian's eyes never left Elena now. "You understand," he said slowly, "that accusing my business partner of something like this could destroy lives." Elena nodded once. "I know. Then why risk it?" For the first time that night, something softened briefly across Elena's face. Not fear, sadness. "Because I already watched one person die after everyone ignored the warning signs." Adrian said nothing after that. Somewhere near the piano, a glass clinked softly against another. Tiny, fragile, human. Nathaniel loosened his tie slightly, though the room was cool, and Elena noticed it immediately. The executive lounge no longer sounded like a celebration. The soft jazz still played somewhere in the background, but now it felt distant beneath the growing tension spreading across the room. Investors whispered quietly among themselves while hotel staff stood frozen near the walls, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of a corporate disaster. Adrian Whitmore remained perfectly still beside the table, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair. Calm, controlled. Yet Elena noticed something had changed in his eyes. Before, he had looked at her like an inconvenience. Now he looked at her like a question he needed answered. Nathaniel stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. "Adrian, this has gone far enough. We are talking about a waitress making wild accusations based on nothing." "I saw your hand," Elena replied softly. Nathaniel turned sharply toward her. "You think seeing someone reach into their pocket makes you some kind of detective?" Elena did not answer immediately. Her silence unsettled him more than words would have. One of the investors finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should postpone the signing tonight." Nathaniel forced another polished smile, though tension now pulled tightly around his mouth. "There is no reason to panic. We have all had a stressful evening." Adrian's gaze drifted toward the untouched whiskey glass now sealed carefully inside a clear evidence bag by hotel security. Actually, Adrian said quietly, there is every reason to be cautious. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The hotel manager approached nervously holding a tablet. Sir, emergency medical services are on their way to test the substance. Elena noticed Nathaniel glance briefly toward the elevators. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Like a man already considering exit routes. She recognized that look too. Adrian turned back toward Elena. You mentioned warning signs before. What did you mean? The question hung heavily between them. Elena hesitated. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed her face. Rain rattled softly against the windows behind her while distant thunder rolled over Manhattan. 3 years ago, she said quietly, my younger brother died after everyone around him ignored obvious changes in behavior. Nathaniel shifted impatiently. This is becoming absurdly personal. Adrian ignored him completely. Elena continued. People think danger always looks dramatic. Most of the time it does not. Most of the time it is small things. Nervous habits. Forced smiles. Someone suddenly acting too calm. Her eyes lifted slowly toward Nathaniel. Someone watching a drink instead of the conversation. Silence followed again. Heavy. Uncomfortable. One of the security guards received a message through his earpiece and immediately walked toward Adrian. Sir, he said carefully, there is something you should know. Nathaniel's posture stiffened almost invisibly. The preliminary field test on the whiskey came back positive for a toxic sedative. The words drained all remaining sound from the room. A woman near the bar quietly covered her mouth. One investor muttered a curse beneath his breath. Adrian said nothing at first. He simply stared at the security guard while rainwater traced silver lines down the glass behind him. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned toward Nathaniel. Tell me, Adrian said calmly, why my drink tested positive. Nathaniel laughed once in disbelief, but this time the sound felt hollow. You cannot seriously think I had anything to do with this. Can you explain it? Adrian asked. Nathaniel opened his mouth, then stopped. Just for a second. But Elena saw it. Panic. Tiny. Brief. Real. Adrian saw it too. The room suddenly felt much smaller than before. More dangerous. More honest. Nathaniel loosened his cufflinks slowly, forcing composure back into his expression. Someone is setting me up. Elena noticed Adrian did not answer immediately. He only studied the man who had stood beside him for almost a decade. Business partner. Closest advisor. Trusted friend. And for the first time all night, Adrian Whitmore looked uncertain about which version of Nathaniel Graves was real. The storm over Manhattan worsened after midnight. Rain streaked endlessly across the towering glass windows of the Blackthorn Grand, while distant sirens echoed somewhere far below the city streets. Inside the executive lounge, the warmth from the fireplace no longer felt comforting. It felt suffocating. Adrian Whitmore stood near the long marble bar with one hand in his pocket, staring silently at the evidence bag containing the untouched whiskey glass. The soft glow from overhead lights reflected across his face, sharpening the tension in his expression. Nathaniel remained across the room, speaking quietly with two attorneys who had arrived almost immediately after the test results. Too quickly, Elena thought, as if he already expected legal trouble tonight. Miss Carter. Elena turned at the sound of Adrian's voice. He motioned toward a quieter corner near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. For a moment she hesitated. Then she followed him. The city below looked unreal from this height. Yellow taxi lights moved through the rain like streams of gold beneath the dark streets. Adrian loosened his tie slightly before speaking. You realize everything changes if this becomes public. Elena folded her hands calmly in front of her apron. I know. Whitmore Technologies loses billions overnight if investors think internal leadership cannot be trusted. And if you had taken one sip? Adrian finally looked at her directly again. Elena noticed how exhausted he suddenly seemed beneath the polished appearance. Men like Adrian spent years building lives that looked untouchable from the outside. But up close, she had learned something important. Powerful people often looked lonelier than everyone else. You were very certain, Adrian said quietly. Most people would have stayed silent. Elena's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain outside. Most people think silence keeps them safe. Adrian studied her for several seconds. What exactly did you do before this? The question lingered between them while jazz piano drifted softly through the lounge. Elena almost smiled, but there was sadness behind it. I used to work in behavioral analysis. Adrian frowned slightly. Federal? She nodded once. Contract work. Mostly threat detection and risk assessment. Adrian looked genuinely surprised now. Then why are you working here? Elena did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly together. Because life changes quickly. Before Adrian could ask more, one of his security officers approached rapidly. Sir, we found something. Adrian turned sharply. The officer handed him a small folded receipt, sealed carefully inside a plastic sleeve. This was recovered from the restroom trash bin near the private lounge. Adrian unfolded it slowly. His expression darkened almost instantly. What is it? Elena asked softly. Adrian handed her the receipt. Printed near the bottom was the name of a private chemical supplier based in New Jersey. But that was not what caught Elena's attention. It was the handwritten note beneath it. Midnight. 1 drink. No mistakes. Elena felt cold suddenly despite the warmth of the room. Adrian's jaw tightened. Who found this? Housekeeping, the officer replied. Security footage shows Mr. Graves entering that restroom approximately 20 minutes before dinner service. Across the room, Nathaniel looked up from his conversation and noticed them watching him. For the briefest second, his confident mask cracked. Not panic. Not yet. But concern. Sharp and immediate. Then the polished smile returned. Elena lowered the receipt slowly. He knows something changed tonight. Adrian's eyes stayed locked on Nathaniel now. He has been my business partner for 9 years. Sometimes, Elena said quietly, the people closest to us learn exactly how to hurt us because we trusted them first. Adrian said nothing after that. Thunder rolled outside again, low and heavy across the skyline. Nathaniel started walking toward them with calm, measured steps, expensive shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. But Elena noticed something Adrian had not yet seen. Nathaniel's right hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cufflink. Small, fast, almost invisible. The kind of detail most people missed. The kind of detail that usually appeared right before someone lost control. Nathaniel Graves stopped a few feet away from Adrian and Elena, his expression smooth again, controlled beneath the golden lights of the executive lounge. If someone had walked into the room at that exact moment without context, they would have seen a successful businessman handling an unfortunate misunderstanding with remarkable composure. That was what made men like Nathaniel dangerous, Elena thought. They understood presentation better than truth. Adrian, Nathaniel said calmly, you cannot seriously be entertaining this. Adrian folded the receipt slowly and slipped it into his pocket. Security footage places you near the restroom where this was found. Nathaniel gave a quiet laugh. I have used restrooms before. I did not realize that was now evidence. Elena noticed he no longer looked directly at her. Instead, he focused entirely on Adrian. Smart. He knew who mattered most in the room. The chemical supplier? Adrian asked. No idea. The note? Also no idea. Nathaniel spread his hands slightly. Someone clearly wants to create chaos before the merger. Adrian remained silent. That silence unsettled Nathaniel more with every passing second. For years, people had probably filled quiet moments around Adrian with explanations, negotiations, reassurances. But tonight Adrian simply watched. Listening, measuring, learning. Elena recognized the shift immediately. Trust was beginning to crack. One of the attorneys approached carefully. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Nathaniel nodded quickly. Exactly. Away from hotel staff and investors. But before Adrian could respond, another security officer hurried across the lounge holding a black smartphone inside an evidence pouch. Sir, the officer said quietly. This was recovered beneath the service elevator. Nathaniel's face lost color for the first time all night. Tiny, almost invisible. But Elena saw it instantly. Adrian did too. Whose phone is that? Adrian asked. The officer hesitated. It belongs to one of the temporary catering employees. Elena frowned slightly. Temporary employee? He checked in 2 hours ago using falsified credentials, the officer replied. And he left the building immediately after the incident. Nathaniel crossed his arms tightly. This proves my point. Someone infiltrated the event. The officer continued carefully. There is more. He unlocked the phone screen and turned it toward Adrian. A series of deleted text messages filled the display. Most had already been recovered by security technicians. Elena saw Adrian's expression harden as he read them silently. Then he handed the phone to her. The final message read, "Wait for confirmation after the drink is served." Elena felt the room grow colder again. Below the message sat a wire transfer confirmation. $50,000. Sent from an offshore account registered to a holding company. Whitmore Strategic Holdings. Adrian slowly looked toward Nathaniel. "That company is under your division." Nathaniel immediately shook his head. "Half the executives in this company have access to those accounts." But his voice sounded sharper now, less polished. The mask was slipping piece by piece. Rain crashed harder against the windows while lightning flashed briefly over the skyline, illuminating the lounge in cold white light. Elena suddenly noticed something else. Nathaniel kept glancing toward the hallway leading to the private elevators. Not casually, repeatedly, like a man waiting for an opportunity. Adrian noticed too. "Nobody leaves this floor," he ordered quietly. Security moved instantly toward the exits. Nathaniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "You are making a mistake." Adrian stepped closer to him. Not aggressive, not loud. Somehow that made the moment heavier. "If I drank that whiskey tonight," Adrian said quietly, "what exactly was supposed to happen tomorrow morning?" Nathaniel stared at him for several long seconds. The lounge had become completely silent again. Even the investors pretended not to listen while hearing every word. Finally, Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Sad almost. You built this empire believing intelligence protected you." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Nathaniel adjusted his cufflink once more, but now his hand trembled openly. "The problem with powerful men," he said softly, "is that eventually they stop noticing who is standing quietly beside them." Elena felt a chill crawl down her spine. Because for the first time that night, Nathaniel no longer sounded defensive. He sounded disappointed. For a moment, nobody answered Nathaniel. The storm outside swallowed the silence between them while flashes of lightning reflected across the marble floors of the executive lounge. Adrian Whitmore stood motionless, his gray eyes fixed on the man he had trusted for nearly a decade. Elena could almost feel the weight of memory moving through Adrian's mind. Board meetings, international flights, late-night negotiations, victories celebrated together. Men like Adrian rarely allowed people close enough to betray them, which made betrayal infinitely more dangerous when it finally arrived. Nathaniel exhaled slowly and loosened his tie another inch. "Do you know how many times I saved this company while you stood on magazine covers pretending to be the genius behind everything?" His voice stayed calm, but bitterness had begun slipping through the cracks. Adrian said nothing. Nathaniel laughed softly to himself. "That is the problem with men like you, Adrian. You think loyalty is permanent because you pay well." Several investors quietly stepped farther away now, as though instinct alone warned them not to stand too close to whatever this conversation had become. Elena remained near the windows, watching carefully. Nathaniel no longer looked like a polished executive. He looked exhausted, like someone who had spent years carrying resentment too heavy to hide anymore. "I built half this empire," Nathaniel continued quietly, "but every headline had your face on it." Adrian finally spoke. "So you decided to poison me?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened immediately. "I never said that." "You did not deny it either." Another flash of lightning illuminated the skyline behind them. Thunder rolled across the city several seconds later, low and distant. Nathaniel looked toward the rain-covered windows instead of Adrian now. "Do you know what I realized 2 years ago?" he asked softly. "You trusted algorithms more than people, profit projections more than friendships. Somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing human beings entirely." Adrian's expression darkened slightly, but Elena noticed something else beneath it now. Not just anger, regret, tiny, controlled, but real. Nathaniel looked back at him. "And then tonight," he glanced briefly toward Elena. "A waitress noticed danger before you did." Those words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Adrian slowly folded his arms. "If you have something to say it clearly." Nathaniel smiled faintly. Tired. Hollow. "Fine." He stepped closer. "You want the truth? The merger tomorrow would have made you untouchable. The board would never remove you after that. I spent 9 years standing beside a man who stopped listening to anyone unless they increased quarterly revenue." Elena watched Adrian carefully. His face remained calm, but she saw his fingers tighten once against his sleeve. Nathaniel's voice lowered. "I told myself removing you would save the company. By destroying it first." Adrian asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. No, by saving it from becoming colder than it already is. The room fell silent again. Somewhere behind the bar, ice shifted softly inside a glass. Tiny sounds suddenly felt louder after Truth entered a room. Elena studied Nathaniel carefully now. His breathing had changed. Faster, less controlled, but not because he feared arrest. It was something else. Relief. Like a man finally too exhausted to keep pretending. One of the attorneys stepped forward cautiously. Mr. Graves, I strongly advise you stop speaking. Nathaniel ignored him completely. His eyes drifted toward Elena again. You know what the funny part is? He said quietly. I almost succeeded because nobody notices women like you. Elena held his gaze calmly. Nathaniel gave a faint, sad smile. Invisible people hear everything. Adrian slowly turned toward Elena then, and for the first time since the night began, there was no distance left in the way he looked at her. No hierarchy. No polished executive detachment. Just recognition. Quiet and uncomfortable. Because the woman standing in a simple black waitress uniform had seen the truth long before the billionaire in the tailored suit ever did. The executive lounge began emptying quietly after that. Investors gathered their coats without speaking much, avoiding eye contact as they moved toward the elevators beneath the soft gold lighting. Wealthy people understood one thing better than anyone else. When power started collapsing, distance became survival. Rain still battered Manhattan outside, turning the city into blurred silver reflections beneath the storm. Nathaniel Graves stood near the windows now, silent while attorneys whispered urgently around him. 2 security officers remained nearby, calm but watchful. Yet somehow the loudest thing in the room was not fear. It was disappointment. Adrian Whitmore walked slowly toward the bar and poured himself a glass of water instead of whiskey. Elena noticed the slight pause before he drank it. Tiny. Automatic. Trust had already changed shape inside him tonight. You should leave before the police arrive, Adrian said quietly without looking at her. Elena blinked slightly. Excuse me. Adrian turned toward her. His voice stayed calm, but exhaustion now sat heavily beneath every word. You already did more than enough. Elena studied him carefully. Men like Adrian usually sounded untouchable in interviews. Sharp, certain, impossible to shake. But tonight he looked different standing beneath the chandelier light with rain shadowing the windows behind him. More human somehow. You think this ends tonight? Elena asked softly. Adrian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Elena glanced briefly toward Nathaniel before lowering her voice. People who plan something this carefully rarely work alone. Adrian's expression hardened again instantly. She watched him process that possibility in real time. Multiple access points. Fake catering credentials. Offshore accounts. Coordinated timing. Too many moving pieces for one angry executive acting emotionally. Adrian looked toward his security chief. Lock down all company servers until morning. No external transfers. No remote access. The guard nodded immediately and stepped away to make calls. Nathaniel laughed quietly near the windows, still trying to control everything. Adrian ignored him this time. Elena noticed something else instead. Nathaniel no longer seemed interested in escaping. That frightened her more than panic would have. Calm people were unpredictable. Her phone suddenly vibrated inside her apron pocket. She froze. Almost nobody had her number. Elena stepped aside near the service hallway and glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. One new message. You should have stayed invisible. Elena felt cold move through her chest. She slowly looked back toward the lounge. Nathaniel remained surrounded by attorneys and security. His phone sat confiscated on the marble table, which meant someone else was watching. Adrian noticed the shift in her expression immediately. What happened? Elena handed him the phone silently. He read the message once. Then again. The storm outside seemed louder now. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Who else knows you were involved tonight? Elena shook her head slowly. Nobody. Adrian looked toward the elevators, toward security, toward the investors still lingering nervously near the exits. Calculating. Always calculating. But this time Elena noticed something different. For the first time since she met him, Adrian Whitmore looked afraid for someone besides himself. You are not going home alone tonight, he said firmly. Elena almost smiled despite everything. I have been taking the subway alone in New York for 6 years. Tonight is different. Their eyes met briefly. Quiet. Steady. No romance hiding inside the moment. Just recognition between two people who suddenly understood danger in the same language. Across the room, Nathaniel watched them carefully. Then slowly, almost sadly, he shook his head. You still do not understand, Adrian. Adrian turned toward him. Nathaniel's voice softened beneath the sound of rain. This was never about money. The room fell silent again. Nathaniel glanced once toward Elena before continuing. You built a world where loyalty became transactional. Eventually, everyone around you started wearing masks. Adrian said nothing. Nathaniel gave a faint, tired smile. She is only alive tonight because she noticed yours before you did. Elena felt the weight of those words settle heavily into the room. Because deep down, part of her already knew something terrifying. Nathaniel was not the only person hiding behind a polished smile inside Whitmore Technologies. By 1:30 in the morning, the Blackthorn Grand felt almost abandoned. Most of the investors had already disappeared into private elevators and waiting town cars, while hotel employees quietly cleaned shattered glass and untouched meals from the executive lounge. Only the storm remained constant. Rain slammed endlessly against Manhattan, washing silver light across the windows high above the city. Elena stood near the service hallway, pulling her coat over her uniform, while two security officers spoke quietly nearby. Her shift should have ended hours ago, yet exhaustion refused to reach her. Adrenaline kept everything sharp. Every sound, every reflection, every moving shadow near the elevators. Adrian Whitmore approached, carrying two paper coffee cups from the closed hotel cafe downstairs. He handed one to her without speaking. Elena blinked in mild surprise before accepting it carefully. Thank you. Adrian nodded once. It is terrible coffee. A faint smile touched Elena's face for the first time that night. Still better than subway station coffee. Adrian studied her quietly over the rim of his cup. Simpler moments probably felt foreign to him. No investors. No cameras. No boardrooms. Just rain and silence and two exhausted people standing beneath dim hallway lights after a night neither of them fully understood anymore. My security team is checking your apartment building now, Adrian said. Elena immediately stiffened. You sent people to my apartment? After that message? Adrian shook his head slightly. Yes. Elena looked away toward the windows. You cannot control every threat. No, Adrian admitted softly. But I can try. Those words stayed between them quietly for several seconds. Then one of the security officers suddenly touched his earpiece and frowned. Sir, he said carefully, we lost camera feeds on the east parking structure for approximately 90 seconds. Adrian's expression hardened instantly. When, 3 minutes ago, Elena's stomach tightened. 90 seconds was enough time for someone trained to move unnoticed. Adrian turned toward her immediately. You are leaving with my security detail. Adrian, that was not a suggestion. Before Elena could answer, another hotel employee rushed into the hallway looking pale. There is a black SUV parked outside the employee exit, the man whispered nervously. Engine running. No plates. The air inside the hallway suddenly felt colder. Elena saw Adrian exchange a quick look with his security chief. Calm, silent, professional, but beneath it sat real concern now. One guard immediately moved toward the elevator while another checked the emergency stairwell. Adrian looked back at Elena. Did anyone know where you worked before tonight? Elena shook her head slowly. Only the restaurant staff. Then her expression changed suddenly. Subtle, but Adrian noticed. What? He asked quietly. Elena stared toward the rain-dark windows. Earlier tonight, one of the temporary catering employees asked me if I always worked Thursday nights. Adrian's face darkened immediately. Why did you not mention that before? Because at the time it felt normal. Her voice lowered. Now it does not. Thunder shook the building softly overhead. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose, thinking fast. Always thinking. You said before that people miss warning signs, he said quietly. Elena nodded once. Adrian looked toward the dark hallway leading to the employee elevators. What signs am I missing right now? Elena answered almost immediately. Nobody is trying to silence Nathaniel. Adrian frowned slightly. Elena stepped closer to the window and stared down at the rain-covered streets below. If he was truly the only person involved, someone would already be protecting him. Adrian's expression slowly changed as the realization settled in. But instead, Elena whispered softly, someone is focused on me. The storm outside roared louder against the glass. Then suddenly, every hallway light flickered once, twice, and went dark. Darkness swallowed the hallway for half a second before the emergency backup lights flickered on in dim red strips along the walls. The sudden change painted everything in shadows and muted crimson reflections. Elena's breathing slowed automatically. Training, observation, focus. Panic narrowed vision. Calm widened it. Somewhere deeper inside the hotel, alarms beeped softly before cutting off again. Adrian Whitmore stepped closer beside her, his posture instantly shifting from corporate executive to survival mode. Report, he ordered sharply toward security. Voices crackled through radios around them. Main grid interruption on levels 30 through 42. East stairwell cameras offline. Backup systems rebooting now. Elena listened carefully while scanning the hallway. Her eyes moved over details most people ignored. A housekeeping cart left abandoned near the elevators. Water dripping from someone's umbrella onto marble floors. One security guard adjusting his earpiece too often because he was nervous. Adrian noticed her watching everything. "What are you looking for?" he asked quietly. "Movement patterns." Elena's voice stayed calm. People preparing to leave usually move differently than people preparing to act. Adrian studied her for a moment beneath the dim emergency lighting. "You really did this professionally." Elena gave a faint, humorless smile. Long time ago. A loud crack of thunder shook the building overhead. At nearly the same moment, one of the security officers cursed softly under his breath. "Sir." Adrian turned immediately. "What?" "Nathaniel Graves is gone." Silence hit the hallway harder than the storm outside. Adrian's face hardened instantly. "How?" One of the service elevators was manually activated during the blackout. Elena felt cold settle into her stomach. Not because Nathaniel escaped. Because blackouts rarely happened by coincidence inside buildings with triple redundant power systems. Adrian grabbed his phone immediately. "Lock every exit in the parking structure." "Already trying, sir. But some systems are still offline." Elena looked toward the dark employee corridor. Something about the silence there felt wrong. Too empty. Then she noticed it. A faint trail of rainwater leading across the marble floor toward the stairwell door. Fresh. Recent. Adrian. He followed her gaze instantly. The water trail ended near the stairwell handle. Tiny droplets still sliding downward beneath the red emergency lights. Someone had entered less than a minute ago. One guard moved toward the door immediately, but Elena grabbed his sleeve softly. "Wait." The guard frowned. "Why?" Elena pointed downward. "The water stops halfway." Everyone looked carefully now. She was right. The droplets suddenly disappeared several feet before the stairwell. Adrian narrowed his eyes. "Meaning?" Elena stepped closer slowly. "Meaning whoever walked here did not continue downstairs." Her gaze lifted upward toward the ceiling. Then toward the dark maintenance access panel directly above the hallway. One screw hung loose. Recently disturbed. Adrian's expression changed instantly. "Get everyone out of this corridor. Now." Security reacted immediately, moving hotel staff and remaining guests away from the hallway. Elena could feel tension tightening through the air around them. Quiet. Sharp. Invisible. The way storms felt right before lightning struck nearby. Adrian looked at her carefully. "How did you see that?" Elena kept staring at the loose panel above them. People under pressure make patterns. They focus on escaping quickly. She lowered her voice. But trained people focus on where nobody looks. Adrian said nothing for a second. Then softly, almost to himself, "And I almost sent you home alone tonight." Before Elena could answer, a metallic sound echoed faintly from inside the ceiling above them. Small, brief, but enough. Every guard instantly looked upward. Adrian stepped slightly in front of Elena without thinking. Instinct. Human. Real. Elena noticed it immediately. So did he. Their eyes met for half a second beneath the emergency lights. Then another sound came through the ceiling. This time clearer. Footsteps. Moving slowly overhead toward the private executive offices connected to Whitmore Technologies. The footsteps above the ceiling moved slowly at first. Careful. Measured. Then faster. Security officers immediately spread through the hallway beneath the dim red emergency lights, while radios crackled urgently in the background. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to sound like static across the entire floor. Adrian Whitmore stared upward toward the dark maintenance panels above the corridor leading to Whitmore Technologies' private executive offices. "Seal the executive server room," he ordered sharply. "Nobody gets inside without visual confirmation." Two guards moved instantly toward the far hallway. Elena remained still beside Adrian, listening carefully. The footsteps overhead suddenly stopped. Silence followed. Heavy. Waiting. Then came another sound. Metal scraping softly against metal somewhere farther down the ceiling structure. Adrian glanced toward Elena. "What now?" Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "They are not trying to escape." Her voice stayed low and steady. "They are trying to reach something." Adrian's jaw tightened immediately. "The merger files." Elena nodded once. "Or the financial records tied to Nathaniel." Adrian pulled out his phone and opened a secure application rapidly. His expression darkened within seconds. "Someone is attempting remote access to internal board accounts right now." Elena looked toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the executive wing. The blackout was never about leaving unnoticed. Adrian finished the thought quietly. It was about creating confusion long enough to erase evidence. Thunder shook the building again overhead. One security officer ran back toward them slightly out of breath. "Sir, server room access just triggered from inside the executive floor." Adrian frowned sharply. "Inside?" "Yes, sir. Somebody already bypassed the east corridor." Elena immediately understood. The maintenance tunnels connect above the executive offices. Adrian looked at her. "How do you know that?" Elena hesitated briefly. Then quietly, "I studied this building years ago." Adrian stared at her for half a second longer than necessary. Questions flickered across his face, but there was no time to ask them now. He turned toward security. "Move." The group rushed down the dim corridor beneath flashing emergency lights, while rainwater rattled against the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Elena followed beside Adrian, her eyes scanning everything automatically. Open doors, camera angles, reflections in polished walls. At the far end of the hallway, the executive office doors stood partially open. One security keypad blinked red. Forced access. Adrian slowed slightly near the entrance. The room beyond was dark except for the glow of computer monitors reflecting pale blue light across glass walls and polished black desks. Elena immediately noticed movement near the far server terminal. A figure in dark clothing transferring files onto an encrypted drive. The person looked up briefly before bolting toward another exit deeper inside the executive suite. Security chased after them instantly. Footsteps thundered across marble floors. Adrian stepped toward the active terminal while Elena moved beside him. Rows of confidential files flashed rapidly across the screen. Offshore accounts, board transfers, internal communications. Elena's eyes locked suddenly on one folder name. Phoenix Initiative. Adrian saw it too. "Open it." Elena clicked quickly through encrypted files while the storm raged outside. Hundreds of financial transactions appeared across the monitors. Illegal transfers hidden through shell corporations tied directly to Whitmore Technologies. But that was not the worst part. Elena scrolled lower slowly. Employee profiles, psychological evaluations, surveillance reports. Adrian's face changed completely. "What is this?" Elena opened another file. Inside sat photographs of board members, executives, assistants, even family members. Notes attached beneath each image. Habits, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. The room suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. Adrian stared silently at the screens while blue monitor light reflected across his face. Nathaniel built profiles on everyone. Elena kept scrolling. Then suddenly her hand froze on the mouse. Adrian noticed immediately. "What?" Elena slowly turned the monitor toward him. One file sat open beneath the others. "Elena Carter." Adrian's expression darkened instantly. The report included surveillance photos of Elena leaving subway stations, arriving at work, sitting alone inside small coffee shops. Notes filled the page beneath them. Former behavioral analyst. Observational risk level high. Potential threat if activated. Adrian looked at her carefully. "They knew who you were before tonight." Elena felt the blood drain from her face as thunder rolled across Manhattan again. Then Adrian noticed one final line at the bottom of the report. "If exposure occurs, neutralize quietly." For several seconds, neither Adrian nor Elena spoke. The glow from the computer monitors painted cold blue light across the executive office, while rain battered the windows behind them hard enough to shake the glass. Elena stared at the surveillance photos on the screen. Subway entrances, coffee shops, outside her apartment building in Queens. Someone had watched her for months, maybe longer. Adrian's expression darkened with something deeper than anger now. Guilt, quiet and heavy. This was happening inside my company, he said softly, almost to himself. Elena kept reading through the files carefully. Not just your company. She opened another encrypted folder. Politicians, journalists, rival executives, private investigators. Entire profiles built around manipulation and leverage. Adrian slowly lowered himself into the leather chair behind the desk, staring at the screens like a man seeing his empire clearly for the first time. Nathaniel created an intelligence network. Elena shook her head faintly. No, Adrian looked up. Elena pointed toward a section labeled Phoenix Oversight Committee. 7 names appeared beneath it. Senior board members, corporate attorneys, external consultants. Nathaniel did not build this alone. Thunder rolled across Manhattan again. Somewhere deeper inside the executive wing, security radios crackled urgently while officers searched the building. Adrian rubbed one hand slowly across his face, exhaustion finally breaking through the billionaire composure he had worn all night. How did I not know? Elena studied him quietly before answering. Because powerful systems reward results before ethics. Adrian gave a faint, bitter laugh. That sounds like something a consultant would say before charging me $10,000 an hour. Elena almost smiled. I used to say worse. Adrian looked at her more carefully now. You really left federal behavioral analysis to become a waitress. Elena's fingers paused over the keyboard. For the first time all night, uncertainty crossed her face again. Rain streaked down the windows behind her, while emergency lights still flickered faintly overhead. My younger brother struggled with addiction, she said quietly. I spent years profiling dangerous people for the government while missing what was happening inside my own family. Adrian listened silently. Elena kept her eyes on the monitor instead of him. One night he called me asking for help. Her voice stayed calm, but Adrian noticed her hands tremble slightly against the desk. I was in Washington working security analysis for a senator. I told myself I would call him back after the briefing. Silence filled the office softly. Human silence. The kind heavier than arguments. By morning, Elena whispered, it was too late. Adrian looked away toward the rain-dark skyline beyond the glass walls. He understood that kind of guilt. The permanent kind. Elena exhaled slowly and straightened. After that, I walked away from everything. Adrian frowned slightly. And nobody came looking for you. Elena clicked open another file on the screen. Her own profile again. Updated 3 weeks earlier. Potential reactivation risk increasing. Adrian stared at it. They did come looking. Before he could respond, one of the security officers rushed into the office. Sir. Adrian stood immediately. What is it? We found Nathaniel. The guard hesitated briefly. He is in the private boardroom upstairs. Adrian's expression hardened. Alone? No, sir. The guard swallowed carefully. 3 members of the board are with him. Elena and Adrian exchanged a long, quiet look. Pieces finally connecting. The merger. The surveillance operation. The fake catering employee. The attempt to erase financial records. This was never about one bitter business partner. It was about an entire system protecting itself. Adrian grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Get every file from these servers copied to external storage immediately. Security nodded and moved fast. Elena remained beside the glowing monitors for a moment longer, staring at her surveillance report. Adrian noticed. What? Elena looked toward him slowly. There is one thing that still does not make sense. What? Elena's eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. If they monitored me this closely, she pointed toward the timestamp on her profile update, then they already knew I worked here tonight. Adrian felt the meaning hit instantly. Cold. Sharp. Immediate. Elena lowered her voice almost to a whisper. Which means they did not accidentally fail to stop me. Thunder crashed outside the building as both of them realized the same terrifying possibility at exactly the same time. Someone inside Phoenix Initiative wanted Adrian Whitmore alive. The private boardroom on the top executive floor overlooked all of Manhattan. At nearly 3 in the morning, the city below looked cold and endless beneath the storm. Thousands of lights flickering through rain like distant signals in the dark. Adrian Whitmore stepped through the glass doors with Elena beside him while security remained positioned outside the room. The atmosphere inside felt strangely calm compared to the chaos downstairs. Nathaniel Graves sat at the far end of the polished conference table with 3 senior board members surrounding him. No one looked surprised to see Adrian enter. That alone told Elena everything she needed to know. One of the board members, Charles Mercer, folded his hands neatly together. Gray hair, expensive watch, the kind of man newspapers described as respectable because he donated to hospitals and spoke softly during interviews. Adrian, he said calmly, this has escalated further than necessary. Adrian stopped near the center of the room. You attempted to poison me. Charles barely reacted. An unfortunate overstatement. Elena felt disgust rise quietly in her chest. Not because they were dangerous, because they sounded reasonable while discussing betrayal. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, exhausted now rather than defensive. I told you he would never understand gradually. Adrian's eyes stayed fixed on the board members. Phoenix Initiative. Charles sighed faintly. An internal risk management program. Elena almost laughed at how clean the lie sounded. Adrian remained perfectly still. You monitored employees, investors, families. Charles nodded once without shame. Information protects corporations. Adrian's voice lowered dangerously. And poisoning CEOs? Another board member finally spoke. Marion Holloway. Elegant, calm, ice hidden behind pearls and a silk blouse. You were never supposed to die tonight. Silence settled heavily into the room. Adrian stared at her. Explain. Marion folded one leg slowly over the other. The sedative dosage was calculated to create temporary cardiac distress, enough to remove you from tomorrow's merger vote. Adrian's expression darkened with disbelief. You nearly killed me to delay a board meeting? Charles leaned forward slightly. To save the company. Elena recognized the pattern immediately. Intelligent people convincing themselves morality became flexible when enough money stood nearby. Adrian looked toward Nathaniel. You agreed to this? Nathaniel gave a faint hollow laugh. You still think this started tonight? Thunder rolled outside while rain streamed endlessly down the glass walls behind them. Marianne opened a thin folder on the table and slid it toward Adrian. The merger would have exposed offshore defense contracts connected to Phoenix. Adrian glanced down at the documents. Financial records, government inquiries, hidden liabilities buried beneath the expansion deal. You were about to sign something that would destroy Whitmore Technologies within 18 months, Charles said quietly. Adrian's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. Elena watched his face carefully. Shock, anger, then something worse. Realization. You built all of this without telling me. Charles answered calmly. Because you stopped listening years ago. The words landed harder than accusations. Adrian slowly lowered the folder onto the table. No shouting. No dramatic outburst. Somehow his silence carried more weight than anger could have. Elena understood something important in that moment. Men like Adrian spent years believing power meant control. But real control belonged to whoever shaped the truth quietly behind closed doors. Adrian finally looked toward Elena, standing near the windows. Her simple black waitress uniform looked almost surreal inside the billion-dollar boardroom. Yet somehow she was the only honest thing left in it. You knew, Adrian said softly to the board members. All of you knew she would stop me from drinking. Marianne's expression softened slightly. We reviewed her profile extensively. Elena felt cold again, hearing herself discussed like a file instead of a person. Charles continued calmly. Behavioral analysts follow patterns. We anticipated she would intervene. Adrian frowned sharply. Then why threaten her afterward? Nathaniel answered this time. Quietly. Honestly. Because some people on the board still wanted you gone permanently. Silence filled the room again. Heavy. Dangerous. Real. Adrian slowly looked around the conference table at the people he once trusted to help lead his empire. Then his eyes drifted toward Elena. She noticed something had changed inside him completely now. The billionaire who entered this building tonight believing he controlled everything no longer existed. In his place stood a man finally understanding how fragile power became when truth disappeared. 3 months later, Manhattan looked different in the early morning light. The storms of winter had faded into softer spring rain, and the city no longer carried the same sharp coldness it had that night inside the Blackthorn Grand. News networks spent weeks unraveling the Phoenix Initiative scandal. Federal investigations exposed illegal surveillance operations, financial manipulation, and corruption hidden behind polished boardrooms and billion-dollar smiles. Several executives resigned quietly. Others disappeared from public life altogether. Nathaniel Graves testified fully in exchange for reduced sentencing, though reporters described him afterward as a man who looked more tired than criminal. Whitmore Technologies survived, but barely. Stock prices collapsed before slowly recovering under new leadership policies focused on transparency instead of secrecy. Journalists called Adrian Whitmore's public reforms revolutionary. Adrian himself never used that word once. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Nothing changed because of brilliance. It changed because one waitress refused to stay silent. On a quiet Thursday morning, Elena Carter stood behind the counter of a small cafe in Brooklyn, pouring fresh coffee beneath warm yellow lights while old jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers. The place smelled like cinnamon, espresso, and rain carried in from the sidewalk outside. Simpler than Manhattan luxury. Realer too. Elena preferred it that way. She wore no expensive jewelry, no polished title, just a cream-colored sweater beneath her apron and the same calm presence that noticed everything around her. The morning crowd moved slowly through the cafe while rain tapped gently against the windows. A construction worker reading the newspaper near the front. A college student asleep over textbooks. Two elderly women quietly sharing blueberry pancakes near the back booth. Human lives. Small moments. Honest ones. The bell above the cafe door rang softly around 8:15. Elena looked up automatically. Adrian Whitmore stepped inside, carrying an umbrella still covered in rain. No security team followed him now. No luxury suit either. Just a charcoal coat and tired gray eyes that looked more peaceful than they had 3 months earlier. The entire cafe failed to recognize him except Elena. Adrian approached the counter slowly while jazz piano floated quietly between them. "You still make terrible coffee?" he asked softly. Elena almost smiled. "Depends how honest the customer is." Adrian nodded faintly. "Then it is still terrible." She handed him a fresh cup anyway. Their fingers brushed briefly against the warm paper sleeve. Simple. Human. Real. Adrian glanced around the cafe before speaking again. "You disappeared after the hearings." Elena wiped the counter gently with a towel. "I was never meant for headlines." Adrian studied her quietly. "You saved my life." Elena shook her head softly. No, her eyes lifted toward him. "Calm as always. I just reminded you to pay attention." Silence settled comfortably between them while rain streaked softly down the windows behind the counter. Adrian finally reached into his coat pocket and slid a small envelope across the counter toward her. Elena frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Scholarship Foundation documents." Adrian wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "For families dealing with addiction recovery." Elena stared at the envelope without opening it. Adrian lowered his voice quietly. "I named it after your brother." For the first time since Adrian met her, Elena looked genuinely speechless. Emotion moved carefully across her face before she blinked it away. Adrian smiled faintly into his coffee. "You once told me silence does not keep people safe." Elena looked out the rain-covered windows toward the waking city beyond them. Then back at Adrian. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the right person simply reminds us who we were before power taught us to stop looking." Adrian nodded slowly. Outside, Manhattan kept moving beneath the rain. Taxis. Footsteps. People carrying invisible battles through another ordinary morning. But inside the small cafe, something quieter remained behind after all the headlines disappeared. The understanding that dignity rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it walks into a room wearing a waitress uniform and changes a life simply by refusing to look away. And if this story reminded you that kindness, courage, and quiet honesty still matter in a world that often rewards the opposite, then maybe leave your thoughts below. Because sometimes the people who change everything are the ones nobody notices at first.